When you think about history, you probably imagine the big events. Wars, elections, inventions, the kind of moments that make it into textbooks. But history isn't only written in bold type. Sometimes it's hidden in the margins, preserved in paper and paste, waiting for someone to care enough to notice. Take the flong. You've probably never heard of it. I hadn't either. And yet, for nearly a century, it was the indispensable middleman between an artist's pen and millions of eyes. A flong is a mold, a reverse impression made from a page of type and illustrations, pressed into damp sheets of paper and glue. It was the way a local paper in Kansas could print peanuts on the same day as a paper in Boston. It was how rotary presses churned out pages fast enough to keep up with the morning coffee. And for decades, no one thought about saving them. Because why would you? They were tools, not treasures. Unless you're Glenn Fleishman. Glenn is the kind of person who sees an artifact like a flong not as a scrap paper, but as an archaeological shard, a fragment of the invisible machinery that makes culture happen. He's a technology journalist, a historian of printing, a podcaster, and a collector of the overlooked. His writing appears regularly, now, thankfully, at 6 Colors, where he covers Apple technology and the culture that surrounds them. He's the author of numerous Take Control books, from privacy and networking guides to explorations of digital communication, and his Kickstarter projects, like 6 Centuries of Type and Printing and How Comics Were Made, bring deep research and beautiful design together to preserve the stories of how our words and images are made. When Glenn found himself staring at a stack of original Peanuts flongs, he saw not just Charlie Brown and Snoopy, but the entire lineage of how drawing became a shared cultural moment. And that's the thing about flongs. They were never meant to last. They were made to serve their purpose, to carry an image from the mind of a creator into the hands of a reader, and then to be discarded. But the few that survive today tell a story, not just of what was printed, but of how it came to be. In a way, our own lives aren't so different. We leave impressions on people, on places, on the culture around us, and most of those impressions fade. But some survive. They become the artifacts of who we were, the mold from which others will cast their own stories about us. That's the part I'm interested in. When the day comes that all that's left of you is an impression you've made, what will that impression say? I'm Pete Wright, and this is Headstone. Glenn Fleishman, thank you for joining me for this conversation.
It's a pleasure. And now when people ask me what I do, I can just play your introduction because it is far more concise than anything I've ever been able to say about myself, and accurate too.
It is a distinct challenge trying to distill what you do, what you have done. That is sort of where I'd like to start. And so I bring you back to your childhood. If you can imagine the time travel. Doodle-doo, doodle-doo, doodle-doo. What is the earliest thing you remember collecting as a kid?
Oh, gosh.
Not because of somebody told you to, not just because you had to.
I'm sure, and I never kept this later, but I'm sure, I collected comic books, but not like people collecting them later. I just accumulated comic books, let's say, and never had a massive collection. In fact, I still have a box of them. Someday I'll, the usual thing. My parents didn't throw them out. They kept them for me, and I need to they've been sitting in a box for 30 years, so I should do something with them, as we all should. But I think I also cut out comic strips because there was a point at which, there were these cheap paperbacks in the 70s you could get, certainly 60s and 70s, that were like collections of Wizard of Id or Peanuts or other popular strips. And but there was also an aspect in which if you wanted to read and reread something in the original form, maybe you had to clip it out of a newspaper. So I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure I clipped them out. But I think it's interesting you asked that, because as I think about it, I don't know that I've often been a collector. What I have has been a kind of researcher. So even as a kid, I found my local library. I don't know how old I was. I was under 11 because we'd moved to a different city when I was 11. They had microfilm and microfilm readers. And I wanted to read a bunch of old comic strips, and I couldn't find the collections in the library through interlibrary loan. I grew up in California. This was before Prop 13, so the libraries still worked at that point. And sorry. And
subtle, Glenn. Well done. Well placed.
I would bike over to this library and would check out microfilm and stick on a microfilm reader and just zzz, and find the page with the comics. And I'd just read like, I don't know, a year's worth of comics, just zipping through and sit there for hours. And I don't know, the librarians probably thought it was funny or normal or whatever, but you could call that a research task. And until you just asked me that question, I remember doing this, but I never thought about it that way. And it's not like I didn't also own collections of comics, but I don't think I ever accumulated much, some books and things. But I always consult sources, libraries or collections or museums. And as we say this, I think it's also, I've been lucky enough in my life to be often near or able to get to places that have collections of things. So as a kid, it's the microfilm and the library. I'd just go sit in the library, and rather than check out a big collection, well, the library is really comfortable. I'm going to sit in a beanbag chair and read, I don't know what terrible strip. I say Wizard of Id because that's, it's long running and not that great. Beetle Bailey, I don't know what was relevant besides Peanuts, but Peanuts and Peanuts-like strips, they just sit there with big collections and read those for hours too. So my family didn't have a lot of money. We weren't poor, but I don't think there was really let's go buy a mother, you need 20 of these, kid, or every birthday I'd get other stuff.
Sure. There's a certain appreciation of the objects of research. And I like you mentioned cutting out strips. I mean, I cut out a lot of stuff from everything because I found those sheets that would go into 3-ring binders where you peel back the top layer. They were like wax, and you stick stuff in it and put the sheet down. It did not matter the subject of the clippings. I loved the act of saving those things irrationally. I had hundreds and hundreds of pages of these things. There is something about the act of research, and you talking about going back to the microfiche puts me in a really interesting sensory place because I was there too. What is it about the nature of touching the research that lights you up so much? And I say that because we're going to talk about this and about the how comics were made and shift happens. Like everything you seem to be doing right now centers on something tactile.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I'm trying to recover something that's been lost, is that our lives were very, very tactile until digital stuff sort of took it all over. And even though I have been, I will say, at the beginning of many digital things, I've been involved, like web design, and I worked for Amazon in 1996, and I started the first web hosting company in 1994, and I never had any lack of interest. My first email account was in like 1986 on what was then on BitNet, ARPANET. I had an account on ARPANET a couple years later. So I've never been shy about any of that stuff, and I've actually made a good hunk of my career out of it. But I also was working in parallel. I always had this connection to print. So my dad had worked at a neat weekly newspaper in Eugene, Oregon, lasted for a few years and then died during a recession. And he learned to do graphic design, and he'd bring home specimen books, and he was doing display advertising sales. So he'd go out and talk to companies, and he'd come back and get stuff typeset. They had some typesetting equipment in the office, and he'd lay out ads. And so from him, I started to develop this secondhand. He wasn't necessarily encouraging or discouraging it, but this interest in type. And so I was coming into the phototype era. So it was still, the tactile process was cutting stuff up and laying it out, drawing lines, working with layout boards. So I wasn't in the metal era. But I from that, I developed an interest in graphic design. I studied in college. I worked at our in-house offset printing plant at my college, and then was involved in printing of all kinds for years, kind of had a hiatus and came back to it. And I've always liked the feeling of something like there's an issue between like efficiency and reality. Like there's an efficiency of doing things digitally, whether that's making a PDF or having an order system online or whatever. Stuff's faster, better, involves less effort for better results sometimes, right? That's kind of this big, like, why do we do things digitally? It's efficiency, right? And but I guess I constantly missed, when I was working almost exclusively in a digital realm, constantly missed having stuff that persisted, because I think there's a bit of irony that digital resources, electronic resources, have a lack of persistence and functionality over time in a way that a book does not. I can go and I have a 500-year-old book here somewhere. Like they're not that expensive if you just want to get a random 500-year-old book. And I've handled stuff that's 500, almost 600 years old, and the fact that they are still, many of them, and not that, a lot of them have disappeared, and most of the books from the late 1400s don't exist, right? There's a tiny percentage that survived, but as a physical object, you get this a funnel. Like the farther, the closer we get in history, the larger percentage of things that survive, and you can see that something that's 100, 200 years old can be in incredibly good condition, still as fully utilizable as it was when it was made. Or when it's printed. Maybe not things that you work with, but actually working in printing, if you work with letterpress printers today, many of them are working with equipment that was built in the 1800s and it's been kept alive since then. So, or you can have a file that you created 10 years ago and nothing will read it today, or a flash.
Yeah, this is the great lie of technology, that I have a book that was printed in 1950 that I read just fine, but a CD-ROM I burned 10, 15 years ago is delaminating.
Yeah, this is a story I tell. Is I was at a conference at one of the XOXO kind of culture tech conferences about 10 years ago, and I was chatting with I'm blanking on his name, Kevin Kelly, one of the founders of Wired, and he does all kinds of really interesting books. He spent like the last 20 years making books of all sizes and types. He's just a fascinating guy. And he had given a talk, and I'd gone up to him. We're just chatting about something, and somebody comes up to us and says, "Hey, I don't mean to interrupt, but can I listen?" Sure. And we're talking about something. And the guy says, "Wait, it must be easier to make an ebook than a print book." And we both burst out laughing, and not at him. It's like, you would think so. It is far easier because when I make a print book, I do one stage of it and then I hand it off to a legion of experts. These other people are, printers are manufacturers. That's their job. So I give them a little bit of information and I talk to them, and then I let the people who know what they're going to do it. With an ebook, you're often, as a self-publisher or small publisher, and honestly, even as a big one, you have to create a process and a workflow, and then be concerned. What it used to be, you have to make Mobi, EPUB, PDF. Mobi's kind of disappeared now. Fortunately, it was a weird format, but EPUB is a difficult format to make because it's trying to serve all purposes. So it has gotten better, but there was this point which, like, I would rather print a book than make an ebook, because I've sometimes spent 20 hours trying to tweak the settings for an EPUB so that it can be read on the multiple test devices I'm looking at, or the multiple websites that simulate different kinds of pieces of hardware.
Electronic publishing for the publisher is a grand antagonist, for sure. It is. It's a horrifying thing. Although you mentioned Mobi, which I haven't thought about in years, and I realize I read the book Hannibal on my Palm Trio, and that excites me just a little bit nostalgically.
Yeah, but yeah, it's so yeah. There's a so I was a liberal arts student. I studied art. I made concentrations in graphic design. I went to Yale. There's a focus on primary materials. I mean, this is what makes a liberal arts college, and is a very big question. But in the arts and the sciences, one of the things that colleges should be doing is teaching you to go to primary sources. You do original research. You go to a lab. You go to a library. You find the first place something happened, because any subsequent use of it is always going to be distorted. And have I found that? Certainly. Or you find that there are multiple original sources. Or, for instance, I did just like a little folio, like a folded over sheet, letterpress printed front and back of Walt Whitman. He has a poem called A Font of Type, and it was just great. So I did that as part of a project a few years ago. And I wanted to reproduce the signature. So through friends, I contacted the person who's in charge of the rare book, the rare book and sort of ephemera collection, special collections over at University of Washington. She's like, "Oh yeah, I'll pull some stuff out." And we're talking, looking over bindings and things. And she said, "We have an original winter bows rather. That's like the collection we were looking at." And she said, "Oh, let me get these." And she grabs these two huge volumes, and the two volumes are two different collections that what do they call it? Not a catalog raisonné, but it's like everything Walt Whitman published in every printing and edition. And so she's like, well, here, you look in that one, I'll look at this one. So this is, okay, it's got the green cover, but it's this, and it's what's the year? Okay, the edition. And there could be like 15 pages for Winter Boughs late in his life, because they would print a book and then it wouldn't be bound till later, depending on cost. So his original Leaves of Grass, Walt would have been the ultimate hipster, went and printed the book with his friend in Brooklyn. It wasn't that hip at the time, but they printed it at his friend's print shop, and they had a break down the type after each form they printed because they didn't have enough type to do that much. They used the paper they had on hand. He could only bind a certain number of copies at once. So the original Leaves of Grass is bound in all kinds of ways as he had money. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, like just to one of the things bibliographers do is they look at editioning, and they you start digging into that field, which is not my field, and you find how many times what's the definitive version of a given book or poem or collection of stories. And even recently, there's a great site you can go to that looks at Lord of the Rings and all the different publishings and every place errors crept in and how they try to correct it with definitive corrected editions, which then introduced errors. And you're thinking, this book was written in the 1950s, or these books. Surely there would be more control. It's like, no. Every time it's set, reset, converted, whatever, or the author makes a change, wants to make a change, there is no definitive thing. So if you don't go back to primary sources and start looking at originals, you don't really know what the intent is, because it's misrepresented both through subsequent printings and editions of the same work sometimes, and it's also misrepresented through the telephone game of people citing things and it getting further and further away. So I found this many times in my research that some salient point, when you dig back down, it's not what's being said at all.
I love that you have taken us down this line, because I have an entire sidebar in which I would like to litigate your role in the word definitive. A lot of the work that I see you doing now, the work that I have sitting on my desk, that you are helping to shepherd in from others, this incredible tome that you worked with Madeand, the Shift Happens, is extraordinary. I have learned so much that I never aspired to learn, but I purchased this thing because, one, you pitched it, and I trust you and your taste and as a fan, and it's extraordinary. And then how comics are made. The one of the newest things that you have here, which is again extraordinary, and you exude the kind of enthusiasm that says to me, here's a guy who just follows an obsession until it turns into a body of work.
Yeah, that's it.
Fair?
That's it. I've been very lucky because we're in a time where that's rewarded instead of punished.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a time in which conventional publishers controlled everything, none of these books would even, well, I shouldn't say that. There was a time in which there were small presses that had tons of money and could charge exorbitant amounts to subscribers or others and produce amazing works that were just unprecedented in scope. And then there was, I think maybe that was through, 1950s or something. I mean, the reason we have Moby Dick as a classic is because there's an illustrator, his name escapes me at the moment. He was he was one of the greatest illustrators of his era, and he was asked what book he wanted to illustrate for American Library, or not the American Library of whatever, one of these things where you pay for books as they come out, right? And he said Moby Dick. He had found it, and it was an obscure piece of work at the time, and he produced an illustrated edition, and which is why we have it. So this bespoke press with an audience at the time, and I don't know. I mean, now, today you'd be hard pressed to find 1,000 people to subscribe to something like this, and now maybe then it was 100,000 people. Like Reader's Digest used to have, 70 million subscribers or something insane. So I kind of look at it as I would have been like a quirky guy doing stuff that never really came to fruition, or maybe have become an academic at a time when you could both get a teaching job and get paid enough to survive on it and be producing papers for other people who were studying this, except no one was really studying comics or printing history in precisely this way until relatively recently. So I'm lucky that I live in an era in which I can pursue the interest, and that I found a revenue spigot that is like inoffensive. Like I'm not selling them as something that it's not. I'm selling people on exactly what it is, and people are excited enough that the math works that I can do this and make a living from it and follow my obscure research interests. And, the last few years, I've supported myself, not entirely, but largely by writing about or supporting these books about somewhat obscure or very obscure bits of technological history, and people love it. And I'm so, so pleased.
What is your position personally as you work on these? And we'll talk about, lump in here comics, 6 centuries of type and printing, Shift Happens. These projects, what is your aspiration around their reputation as definitive?
Yeah, so I'll bump up a different layer because I think this applies directly, is I am most intrigued in stories not told. So that's part of it. So that doesn't mean anything's definitive, but this goes back to me starting as a freelance journalist in the 90s, where I got in the back door. I don't have a journalism degree. I hadn't written for publications, but I wound up being able to write for computer publications, and then into the New York Times, then into the Economist, because I had specialized knowledge that staff writers didn't have. And so I would pitch a story, and an editor would be like, that is really interesting, and I don't think anybody here knows anything about it. Sure, you can write it. And that was my career for about 15 years of freelancing was, yeah, Glenn knows what this is about. We'll have him do it. And then gradually, like every new thing that came out, after a few years, the staff writers, who were busy with a lot of bread and butter work or features that were huge in scope, they would gain enough knowledge that they would fill that in. They'd be like, oh, Bill or Joan is writing about this now. So we really got someone covering it. So I had to keep reinventing myself. So from that experience, I've always, but like in the last decade, I've said, what can I do that someone's not doing that would be interesting and intriguing enough to people to help support me or to pay me a fee if I'm writing for them? And these books, like my support of Marcin and his Shift Happens, and my 2 latest books are definitely from that. I mean, how comics were made is the pinnacle of it, where I started coming across things I didn't understand and couldn't find anything definitive written about it, anything at all in some cases written about it. I'd find an article from Popular Mechanics in 1926 that explained the role of flong in cartoon syndication. And I'd be like, all right, well, and then I found later Popular Science in 1940 did a very similar article, including how comics were colored. And I thought, well, that's a long time ago. No one's really written about it since. And these are short articles. And those are the closest things, and so as I dug, I found more bits and pieces. But I think there's this combination of forgotten and hidden labor, sort of forgotten people, lost knowledge, and things people are intrigued by as soon as they know they exist. And when I combine those together, I think that makes for a powerful book. And that's how I advise people who are trying to, write something like this too. They usually come to me with what they have, but I'll tell somebody like, the really interesting thing here is not that, it's this part. Cause no one's, I'm working with an author right now. We're past the editing stage, but in he wanted to get the manuscript down. And at some parts I'm like, this is a great story, but I know there are 50 books that told that story before. So you could tell it again, and you could tell it in 4 pages, but you could also tell it in 2 paragraphs and have a bibliography, because your story, you're getting off the main thrust of your story, which is unique, never told before, to go into a story everyone's heard, and they're going to, or a reviewer's going to go. So he took some of that advice really well, which is great. As an editor, you want to not say things people aren't useful to people. But the definitive aspect of that becomes from, it's easy to be definitive if no one's ever told the story before.
Right. That's a shortcut, right?
So Marcin's book, Shift Happens, people have written about typewriters, of course, and about computer keyboards.
Not like this.
He set out with a scope. I don't think he ever intended it to be this big in scope. And when I first started working with him, I think the manuscript was 325,000 words. And we spent a lot of time on that Everest, cutting it down to, a slightly smaller mountain. Originally it was going to be one big volume. It was just, he had done the same thing I did. Each chapter, he'd uncovered so much that he was, there's a few chapters where I'm like, all right, this story has been told, but not exactly in this way. Or this story has been told, but like he got an interview with the fellow who was Sinclair Computers, the big computer designer for Sinclair, just before he died. He has a few stories. There's actually a few people in the book that Marcin interviewed, not knowing that they were actually, one person was dying when they spoke to him, but other people who it just happened, he interviewed them within a year or two or three, they passed away. So he was the last person to do a significant interview with some of these folks about their life's work or an aspect of it. And I think so. I think it's 40 chapters across the 2 volumes, and almost every chapter contains something, or the entire chapter has never been told in that way before, or that definitively, because he did the thing. He went back to source material. He did interviews. He traveled. He, looked at things that no one had ever seen before. I have touched so many things that people haven't seen in 100 or 200 years, and I get excitement every time that happens, not because of the exclusivity. So, it's like, then I say, hey, everybody, you should go see this thing. It hasn't been available before, but it's been discovered. So everyone should go and touch this thing that's 200 years old, like very carefully, but should all touch it.
That comes through in the work, for sure. And I opened with I learned a lot about flongs just thinking about preparing for this interview. And you say in an author's note, page 25, under an 1862 illustration of the first appearance of the word flong in print, you say, author's note, the first time I saw the word flong, I fell in love. When I found out its role in the history of printing, it's no understatement to say that it led to this book. Your writing is full of that sort of enthusiasm, and I sort of see you as a magnifier of enthusiasm. But the other side of that, it strikes me, with the kind of work that you're shepherding into the world, is all around the burden of completeness, right? That the challenge of trying to create something that is aspirationally thorough, definitive, is knowing when you're finished. Mm-hmm. How do you know you're done? How did you know you're done with comics?
When I reached 288 pages. That's an evenly divisible by 32, an important unit in printing.
No pragmatic answers allowed, Glenn.
Well, I started to chart out what I thought would be most interesting to other people. Is kind of how I came about it, because there were so many things I could talk about, and there were things to which I didn't yet have the answers when I started working on the book. So I charted out, how can I break this up? And one of it, of course, was generational. Like these generational changes in technology drove things that you see in your own life, and explains why, if you're this many years old or you're looking at old comics, here's why this happened. And I would say the other part of that, with that book in particular, with how comics are made, is my friend Matt Bors, who's an editorial cartoonist, who's now kind of retired from that. Now he's a comic book writer and having a lot more fun. Not fun to be an editorial writer or editorial cartoonist these days. I was chatting with him because he's done a lot of Kickstarters, and he had a publication called The Nib that ran for 10 years and 40 issues as a quarterly that was comics, journalism, and cartoons. And I told him about this book, I don't know, a good year before much more over a year before I was launching it. And he said, he didn't even know he told me this, but he said it seemed like I should be including more about creators, because I had looked a lot at the technology. So I just thought it was a great idea. And I wound up interviewing about 40 people, mostly cartoonists and some production people, other people involved in the comic strip and comic book industry. And that helped me shape the story better, because I heard over and over again the same arc of story from these people. So when I was trying to figure out how to tell the story, to me, it was kind of mostly like, cartoonist draws a thing and then it goes through this process and here's the result. As I talked to more people, I realized that there was this arc of like the transformative aspect of it and the people involved in transforming it, and the extent to which many people involved had no communication or interaction with anybody else. So I tried to make it a technology story, always the best ones, about people. And so you'll notice in the book, almost every photo I was able to get has somebody in there, sometimes a lot of people.
Yes. Mostly
unidentified if they're not a cartoonist. In a few cases, I was so excited when it would be like, Joe Brisbane is making flongs at the Indiana Herald Tribune or something. And I'd be like, oh, great, Joe, there we go, we got a name. So, or I'd find a photo of a woman involved in some aspect of cartoon production or print production, because there was, due to unions, the unions really kept women out of printing until I mean, really the 1960s and even later. So it was so exciting to see those pieces. So in shaping the story as a whole, it was chronological, but the arc about how the cartoonist interacted with the final product as opposed to the process of transformation being the center.
What a fantastic metaphor for what modern sort of digital creators are living through here. The ownership, the authority, the agency that creators have over every single step. It goes back to our comments on creating EPUBs as a self-publisher, right? But being able to see yourself as a personality at the center is a sort of emotional payoff, one of respect.
Well, I'll tell you one great aspect of this is I went on press with so I did a Kickstarter edition of how comics were made, and then sold the rights to Andrews McMeel Publishing, which is producing now a bookstore edition. You can find in bookstores, called How Comics Are Made, which they thought would be a better title for someone to see on a bookshelf, which I agree. And anyway, so on this first printing I did in 2024, I had it printed up in British Columbia. I drove up and spent just a full day on press. This place is very efficient, beautiful work. And I've always worked alongside press people. I worked in plants. I've gone on press before, whatever. It spent 2 weeks when we did, Marchie and I did Shift Happens. We spent 100 hours on press for that book in Maine, in 80-degree weather outside and a little bit cooler inside. But so up in British Columbia, the printers are looking at this. We're pulling sheets off. And this one guy had worked there 37 years. He's like, oh, I remember that. Oh, that's, I remember that time. Yeah. Oh, I did that. This is a book about them. And I hadn't thought about being with printers while they're printing a book that's about printers. And so all the press people were like, they weren't like, I mean, they had work to do and whatever. We'd talk about stuff. They'd point things. I'd pull a sheet off and say, do you remember that thing? And they're like, oh yeah, my dad used to, because often it's like multi-generational stuff. It was just kind of exciting to be having a book. Like the point of the book was these people in part, like it's cartoonists, it's colorists and production people in the cartoon process, the people at the syndicate, the people in the printing, and the people in the newspaper printing plants. And it just, there was something really lovely about being able to say, yeah, they're like, yeah, I'm never in a book. And so when I had extra copies at the end, because I had a few extra, I was like, please make this available to anybody in the printing plant who wants a copy. They're welcome to one, because this is their book too.
Do you think you have a natural bent toward documenting the kinds of culture that are in danger of being forgotten? Is that intentional?
Maybe. I think it's, I sort of resent losing knowledge. I sort of hate that humans create incredible things and they're like, oh, that's done. We're done with it. And so it's, my books have been a little bit of a memorial to cleverness that is no longer needed. So Flong is a great example, is from Gutenberg's, mass production of printed material. He wasn't the first, but he was the first to kind of move it along into what became a mass medium, or a mass production medium. People were trying to figure out how to set less type and how to print more quickly. And a Flong is kind of the answer. Well, and it took centuries to develop to a point where they actually had a technology that was consistent, affordable, and produced good enough quality. And where instead of having to set type by hand each type or keep huge amounts of type sitting around in case you want to reprint something, you would just have these sheets, either molds or you'd have thin plates made from them that you could use again. So like Oxford University Press at one point in the early 1800s, they would have tens of thousands of sheets of metal that were essentially the book pages that they could just reprint from, like the Bibles typically, but some other volumes. So these things aren't needed anymore. We don't need that technology at all. But for the reason that the production of print, that the size of newspapers, size of books, the volume of things that were printed, and their cost, those went up. Cost went down dramatically. Partly improvements in how cheaply they could make paper and how fast, significant. But also the Flong is the secret for why things could go faster, and it enabled every development. And without it, things would have remained stagnated and slow. Newspapers would have been small. There wouldn't be much employment. Maybe it would have been better for the world to have less information disseminated. I don't know at this point. But so the forgetting of the Flong isn't, oh, we should celebrate it every day. It should be a Flong. Every day is Flong Day. It's more that this was a critical technological innovation that no one seems to really remember. So without having something that helps keep it in people's minds, it will absolutely be forgotten, because even there's still people today who work with later forms of it. I did a papercraft day at the Ohio State University's the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum, which was my semi-home away from home, across several visits while researching how comics were made. And they invited me back to do they had an exhibition up, and they did some stuff for kids, and I was in the library we had all these materials, and so I was showing them how stuff worked. People would come in and explain flong and stereotype plates and all this. Anyway, one guy who came in was a retired printer, and he had spent 50 years working at mostly small newspapers. And I said, did you call them flong? And he's like, no, we called them mats. You'd laugh at anybody who called them a flong. Other newspaper printer, because mats short for matrices
Sure.
or matrices. But he had worked with all this stuff, and he worked into the offset time when the technology changed and got out of the business after that. But I thought, we still have living memory, and I was able to talk to some people involved in that. I was able to talk to the cartoonists who were interacting not with printers, but kind of how to deal with the back and forth of the limitations of doing color in the metal printing age, where it was very complicated, time consuming, expensive, and super involved process. So I know that we're going to forget things, right? This will sound like a far aside, but there's it's like a flint napped arrowhead or something. I think that's the thing. I don't remember the exact details, but someone was discovered to have been forging them for years and selling them as real. And that was bad. But the thing was, he had rediscovered something that humanity had lost for 1 million years. No one knew how to make these, and he had figured out how to recreate them. That was good. It's too bad he didn't figure that part first and get hired by museums to create them, because he might have done a lot better and not gone to prison, which I think he did.
Oh my God. Let's all hope better for our current craft of creators. But that actually brings us to what I think is an interesting pivot, because everything we're talking about here is your work to craft, to cultivate a story around capturing things that are in danger of being lost, your resentment of that. But we have yet to talk about the other side of creation. Once you're finished, so much of what you're doing would not exist without community. What is your expectation around your community? I mean, you release a book or set of books that's 700 some odd pages, or the comics. These are giant books. What is your expectation of me as a member of your community, as a fan?
Oh my gosh, that's an excellent question. This is always a question as an author: is you don't know how many people read your books. You know how many people buy them if you're lucky, and you have a total somewhere. And as doing a lot of Kickstarter work, I know kind of precisely, and then doing my own fulfillment, I know exactly how many people bought the books. And I would say what's gratifying is that I know from feedback from people that a lot more people have read Shift Happens, not my book, but I saw, Martine Cicely on a lot of that stuff. I know people read Shift Happens, How Comics Were Made, and 6 Centuries of Type and Printing. I had a previous edition, but even the book's just being delivered, and people are like, I'm just going to sit down and read the whole thing. I'm like, yay. So some of what I'm doing now grew out of, I did a project a few years ago and started in 2019 called the Tiny Type Museum and Time Capsule. And that was driven by the same idea. Part of it, this will sound silly, is I was thinking about how can I do something that actually was expensive. And I mean this in the nicest way. How could I do something that cost a lot to make and do in small quantities? Because there's the idea of, let's say you want to do $100,000 project on Kickstarter. You could sell 100,000 things for $1 each. That's really inefficient and hard to fulfill, and it's not going to work. Or you could do 10,000 for $10, etc. And I thought, Kickstarter had this timing worked out well. They were doing these 100 for January thing. So it was projects in which the quantity was limited to 100. And I thought, I'd been kicking around this idea with a friend who was a woodworker and was actually studying cabinetry in a formal program. And we agreed to make this thing that was a case. The whole thing was, the Kickstarter fee was $1,000 for these cases full of type artifacts, some things made for the campaign, some things I'd collected. There's a little flong in it. There's just a little bit of everything, and the book 6 Centuries was part of it. And the case alone should have cost $2,000. And I caught my friend when she's still in training, so it wound up being a subset. If she did it now, the amount of effort and work and care in these things, they're gorgeous. So that project was a bit of I want to disseminate something that will last. What's the best way? I'm going to make something so precious, people will keep it and they'll hand it down. and it's valuable. It's a museum. It's actually, you can open it up and take it all out, and it is a cabinet of wonder. It's every kind of thing about printing that has survived in pieces that you could stick into the size of a bread box, let's say. And so there's technically 108 copies all over the world, mostly the United States, but there's like one in Dubai. There's one in, several in Germany. And this follows the process of it's locks. It's actually a digital philosophy. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. LOCKSS. And it's just the notion that you have so many of something that even if there's a massive disruption in society or massive loss, you haven't lost that knowledge.
This is seed vaults spread around the world. This is
right.
Similar conceits.
Or it's often digital archives is kind of where it comes from, but I think the physical case is very good. Seed vaults. So the Tiny Type Museum is a seed vault for printing. And conceivably, if the entire world fell into madness and whatever, you could probably reverse engineer how to make what you needed from what's in the museum. Not exactly, but close.
I had no idea that's one that I did not understand what that was before this conversation.
I mean, it's a beautiful set of stuff. Like that was the intent. It was supposed to be pretty and exciting. And it is, like, if you wanted a teaching set, it is an incredible teaching set if you're trying to teach the history of printing through material objects. So there is that too, but it is also, that's why I called it the Tiny Type Museum and Time Capsule. Is in 500 years, if somebody finds one of these intact, I mean, I'd hope, unless society collapses, in 500 years, there could be 20 or 30 of these still kicking around, and they would tell, there might be more that's forgotten by then, and this would be a reminder.
And they probably won't find a PDF documenting what was in it.
Exactly. There's a little memory stick in it, so if that's still readable.
Outstanding. A little nod to our recent past. Okay, so this idea of community, particularly around Kickstarter. Kickstarter has been very, very good to you.
Very good to me. The lovely people there. They've been very supportive as an organization. I would say they don't support people just because they're successful. There's a certain kind of person they like to help encourage, and it's somebody who is, I mean, you've said it about me. I will say it about myself. I'm pretty enthusiastic, and they love people who have enthusiasm and really use their tools well and also fulfill projects. So they have great liaisons in different fields, including they have a separate comics and publishing person. They used to be one job. And so I've reached out to them. And so they offer advice. They promote the projects they like. And it's just it's a neat place to do a project. But then the community is amazing. There's Kevin Kelly again, the 1,000 True Fans theory. I don't know if I have 1,000 true fans, but I don't know that you need 1,000. There is some number of people you need. And I think 6 centuries of type and printing, I had 2,000 backers for a pretty small and modest book this last February, March. And I was really blown away by that. And it is in part because other people I know promoted it on their website. So like, Glenn's doing this thing, you should go find it, which is great. That's part of the community too. But I think I now have enough people I've seen people who've been involved in 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 or 6 things I've done over the years, and they're still there. And some of them become true patrons in the sense of, like, I'll put up a high tier item and they're like, great, I'm in, boom. That's mine. And, I've become friends with some of those people. It is, there are some of the Kickstarter Medicis are out there, and they help these things happen. They help these things happen because the truth is that higher tier rewards, things that are a little more special and more expensive, that have intangible value, there's always some real value to it too. Those help drive the part that, like, the money that goes beyond, like, this is an okay return, but not a great hourly wage, to I have done something that's both meaningful to people, produce something that I'm really proud of, and I'm paying myself something that's a livable wage, plus putting some money away for the future against future projects and development. So that is, without that, I'd be scrambling more. And so it's not that I view people who do a normal pledge as worse, but I appreciate them because I need a lot of people just who want the book. because otherwise it's not possible. And then I'll have higher tier things where someone says, I actually want this bonus thing, and some of it's goodwill because I want you to succeed, and some of it is, this is a cool thing that I wouldn't otherwise have, and so I'm going to support you at that level. And that really helps the projects come together. You need both ends. And some people do just the thing, right? But then you need a lot more people involved. And I think those folks need a bigger community. I have a small community that is intensely interested. Some subset is intensely interested. And so I can leverage that so that I can, give those people what they want. And part of what they want sometimes is for me just to be making things, which is incredibly generous.
Well, this gets to this idea of Kickstarter celebrity. And I will broaden it beyond that. But for example, I'm a big movie guy, so all my metaphors invariably lead back to film. I will, after just a couple of successes, I will go see every Edgar Wright movie. That guy could take an enormously stupid swing. I will be there opening weekend and I will see it, right? That's earned reputation for me as a fan. I am absolutely there with you on Kickstarter, right? This idea that if you put up a pledge, it sort of doesn't matter, or a project, it doesn't matter what it is, because I'm curious about what you're curious about. That is its own sort of form of celebrity. And I'm curious if you've ever put yourself in that in that position. Have you ever thought about yourself in that light?
No, and you just gave me an incredible insight. It's something I don't think I've ever thought about in this way, so good on you as an interviewer, which is that people have lots of different interests in lots of different directions. And there are people I follow on like Blue Sky, or their projects I follow on Kickstarter, or in real life. I keep track of, I get their mailings, or I go to their events or whatever. And it's because what they do is interesting, and it's stuff I wouldn't find on my own. So it's like not tastemakers, but it's like, this, let's see, who's a good example is these folks, it's Sayway and Taylor are these two married couple who are industrial designers, and everything they do is fascinating. And they're early Kickstarter early Kickstarter campaigners. Their studio name will come back to me, but they just make fascinating stuff. And I haven't backed every project they've done, but I've backed a lot of them because they're just, here's this is a pen they made. I'm showing it to Pete. People listening can't see it, but it's like this clever mechanical pen that pops out, and so that you can anyway, I can't even do it with two hands. It's two hands, but they just their thoughtfulness about physical exploration of form and what's manufacturing. And I'm not on Instagram anymore, but on Instagram they would post all these process methods about how they're testing things and doing water jet cutting, and just like they're the kind of people that give them a genius grant, but they don't have one, so they're using Kickstarter.
Sure, yeah, and you are, as a fan of their kind of intellectual professional celebrity. I think Kickstarter unlocks a part of that in a way that surprises me, continues to surprise me. I love the Medici Kickstarter, or the Kickstarter Medicis too. That's absolutely there. I'm trying to connect you. We were talking about you as a kiddo, and you today. If you were to open, say, 13-year-old Glenn's bedside table drawer, and your bedside table drawer today, how connected do you think those would be?
Well, my bedside table drawer today is empty for some reason. I don't keep anything in my bedside table drawer, so that's a metaphor.
It is.
Metaphorically. I won't be metaphorically. Well, back then, it'd be full of, have comic books and the little paperback Fawcett, Peanuts collections, and pens and rubber bands and batteries, and probably piles of resistors. I was doing some soldering and board stuff at some point, so there'll be like little components and things, although I was almost past that, probably at 13 already, my jaded age of 13. And some nonfiction books. Maybe there'd be a book in there about like the periodic table, and there'd be lots of like little science fiction titles, some like the more kid-oriented stuff. Maybe Foundation would be in there. Maybe I'd be ready for that by then. But kind of that would be sort of my melange of stuff. Today, what's in my metaphorical? It's too many books. It's really the metaphorical bedside table is really crowded. There's 1,000 books I need to read, most that are nonfiction. I bought a book. One of my elder kids home for the summer from college, and he looks over at the table. He's like, "Why do you have a book called The Price of Yarn?" And I said, "Listen." It's first of all, it's short. It's my statement. Second, it's about the yarn industry in Canada and reestablishing domestic Canadian yarn production instead of the focus they have now on meat production by a yarn producer who started. And also, the bookseller was hit by tariffs, and it seemed like they were going to go under. And I was passionately interested, and so to support them, I bought the book, and then I got this book.
And
now
who's not interested in that?
Right. So like, I want to know the price of yarn. It's only like a 100-page little book. I'm like, I want to know about the price of yarn. But so I have 1,000 books like that to read. I don't know, and loose bits of letterpress type are in there as well,
fantastic.
and probably some drawing instruments and many different pieces of paper that have important writing on them that I only write on to remember something and that I don't need the paper anymore. And then I don't keep old iPhones or iPads. I recycle or downcycle them to other people, right? But I have 12 Android phones that of years past that I use for testing, and 4 dead hard drives. So that's my
okay.
It actually need to go into electronics recycling.
It actually
as
sounds
well.
like you're pretty much the same guy.
I have gotten rid of most of my cables. I don't have any SCSI 3 cables. All right?
Okay, fair.
So if you need one, don't come to me. I don't have it.
All right, here we are. We've reached the end of our time together, and so we have the question. There is a day that comes when all that's left is the impression you've made on others, your personal flaunt, Glenn. What do you want it to say? What do you want it to say on your headstone?
Well, first, I want a picture of myself in verse that someone can rub and see my big bald head on it. But you stole my thunder a little, because what I want it to be is I want it to say, he made an impression.
Glenn, that's so perfect. I didn't steal anything. You did it so much better. That's beautiful.
That's what I wanted. It could also say, I read a book in high school German. It was about Heinrich Schliemann, and he was the guy who rediscovered Troy in North Africa. And the title was very simply, it was like, erfand Troy, which is he discovered Troy. And I thought there is something like, I want it to say he rediscovered Flong, something like that. But I think he made an impression is a little bit shorter and sweeter, and it has some multiple meanings.
It is just lovely. Well, I'll tell you what, Glenn Fleishman, you are a delight. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I am honored to call myself a fan of your intellectual curiosities. May they keep coming.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your support. And morale support is as important as financial support. And one thing Kickstarter does for sure is it puts them on equal steading, where often morale support is kind of intangible and hard to do. So people don't have to put money in the kitty for me to feel great about what I'm doing. But Kickstarter is an interesting mix of the two. So people who just say, what you're doing is interesting to me, is as much of a buoy in my work as someone who says, I want to buy that thing. Buying it is nice. That helps on the financial side. But the this is cool, this is interesting, makes it even more meaningful for me to keep doing it.
Well, I am so glad to be able to call myself then also a morale supporter. Keep it coming, man. Thank you. It's now been a few weeks since my conversation with Glenn, and in that time I've developed a strange new hobby: mechanical keyboards. I've been swapping out switches and keycaps and chasing that old-fashioned clack, trying to make every word I type sound like it came from my dad's newsroom in 1985. It's ridiculous and fantastic, and a little bit I blame Glenn. Talking with somebody who cares so deeply about the tactile history of printing has clearly rubbed off. Where he finds meaning in flongs and letterpress, I think I'm finding it in PBT plastic. Different tools. Maybe a little bit of the same obsession with how ideas make their way into the world. What stuck with me most about Glenn is his devotion to the overlooked, the scraps, the obsolete processes and forgotten tools, all the things most of us would throw away when we're finished with them. He sees them as cultural touchstones. He reminds us that our lives today aren't so different from the lives of those who came before us. Most impressions fade, but some survive. And those few become the stories people tell about us. Thank you for making it all the way through today's conversation. If it left an impression on you, the best way you can help is to share the show with a friend. Rate it, review it wherever you listen. It helps more than you know. And I'll catch you next time, right here, sitting around the headstone.